What would you do if the person who slapped you in court turned out to be the one hiding the truth about your father's death? A 16-year-old boy, an old worn-out necklace, and a stare that made the entire courtroom fall silent. When justice is twisted by prejudice, can a lone boy spark a reckoning in a system built to silence him? This isn't just a story that makes you think. It might just change the way you see the world. If you believe justice deserves to be seen and heard, hit like, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Because what's coming, you won't see it coming. Levi Hartman, 16 years old, stood before the Westfield Civic Court, his eyes clouded with confusion, one hand clenched tightly around a scratched silver necklace, the only thing left from his father, who died in the Wendrix factory explosion years ago. Beads of sweat gathered on his brow, but he stayed silent as a white officer approached. Ezra Calloway, cold gaze sharp as a blade. He glanced at the necklace and muttered a line that made the entire courtroom freeze. "This trash? You call this a memory?" Levi said nothing. But the moment Celeste Warren, his mother, walked into the courtroom, every expression in the room changed. Ezra took a step back, hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip, as if he'd seen a ghost. Because 8 years ago, Celeste was the first to expose corruption inside their town's police department, and nearly lost her life for it. A heavy silence fell. Sunlight poured through the courthouse window, spotlighting Levi like he was on a stage, the unwitting center of an impossible confrontation. But the question hanging in the air wasn't just for the jury. It was for everyone watching, in the room or beyond. If the truth makes you tremble, then who should really be on trial? And as Levi lowered his head, fingers brushing the necklace, retrieved from the rubble next to his father's broken body, there was only one feeling left for those watching. This was no ordinary trial. This was where a memory was about to set justice on fire. It was the last gift from Calvin Brooks, Levi's father, the factory worker who died in the Durham Steelworks explosion, a tragedy still buried under the label of a technical malfunction. Levi never stepped onto Ezra Calloway's lawn. He simply stood behind the fence, at the exact spot where his father was arrested before vanishing for good. But the police report said otherwise. And strangely enough, Chief Ezra, the very man who led the original explosion investigation, is now the one pressing charges against Levi. Why would a man in power target a child over trespassing on grass? Or was it because Levi is the only one brave enough to return to the place where the memory began? When Ezra mocked the necklace, no one heard Levi's reply. But everyone saw Celeste Warren, his mother, rise slowly from her seat, holding a single USB drive in her hand. No one in that courtroom expected what came next. The long-lost security footage from the broken Durham plant camera, quietly recovered by Celeste after 8 years of relentless searching. But she wasn't done. She submitted an audio recording alongside it, a conversation between Ezra and a supervisory inspector. The tone, mocking, the content, a clear directive to kill the investigation. The air in the courtroom turned to ice. Levi's gaze shifted, no longer afraid but steady, drawn to his mother. He wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, his father had never truly died in silence. He left behind a trail, one that led them straight to this moment. Levi was accused of trespassing in Millcroft Glen, more specifically, of stepping on Lieutenant Ezra Calloway's lawn. Calloway, a white police officer with a shadowy past linked to the death of Levi's father, Calvin Brooks. But when the courtroom lights dimmed and the recovered footage played, showing Levi standing still, unmoving outside the fence, every accusation began to crumble. Before Ezra could even open his mouth to object, Judge Naomi Prescott entered. She didn't look at anyone. She simply placed her hand on a sealed folder and began to read aloud, each word echoing from a handwritten letter Calvin had once tucked away in an old book, hidden beneath the bed. Her voice rang out, cold and cutting. "If anything happens to me, find someone named Naomi. Ezra knows everything, and I'm afraid it's going to kill me." Ezra Calloway's name dropped like a hammer from the past. His eyes darted. His grip tightened around the folder until the edges tore from pressure. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, seconds from shattering. Naomi paused. Then with a calm finality, she said, "As a federal judge, I hereby order the immediate suspension of Lieutenant Ezra Calloway in a full special investigation into the Durham Steelworks case." Ezra leapt to his feet, shouting protests, but no one listened anymore. The crowd behind Levi was already rising. An elderly woman quietly wiped away tears. A young child looked up at his mother and whispered, "Is he the bad guy?" In that moment, Levi said nothing, but his small shoulders, once seen as fragile, were now holding open a long sealed door to justice, one that had been locked for nearly a decade. Ezra sat in court, eyes like sharpened glass, staring at Levi as if the boy's very existence was a threat. But Levi didn't flinch. He didn't respond with rage. He just looked back, steady, unwavering, as if he were staring into a past he was finally ready to release. Not to forget, but to stop letting it control him. Celeste Warren, the mother who once crumbled under the weight of losing her husband, now stepped forward, not as a witness, but as the keeper of one last truth. In her hand was a recording, a voice from years ago, Calvin Brooks saying, "If you ever have something to say, speak to the truth, not to anger." Naomi Prescott fell silent. For the first time in her long career, she wasn't just a judge. She became the one who opened the door for truth to finally step in. Even if it had arrived late, a boy stood, no lawyer, no protection, no one to speak for him, just an old necklace in the name of a father who never got justice. But this time, the community didn't stay silent. One of Levi's former teachers stepped forward and said, "This boy once found my wallet and returned it without taking a cent. And now, we call him a criminal?" People began to rise, one then another, then the entire room. No shouting, just a sea of quiet, steady gazes, as if they owed Levi something they hadn't had the courage to give before. Levi lifted his head, holding his father close, not for revenge, but to carry him forward, and he said, "I don't need anyone to believe me, because the truth, it will speak for itself." When Ezra saw the necklace, he sneered, calling it useless junk for someone like him. But he had no idea. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a silent vow Levi had carried for 8 long years. After the trial ended, Levi stepped out of the courthouse into the fading sunlight. There were no cheers, no applause. But behind him, one by one, from janitors to lawyers, from a small child to an elderly man, they stood. Not because he had won, but because he was the only one who had dared to stand when everyone else looked away. Celeste walked up beside her son. She didn't say a word, just placed her hand gently on his shoulder. But in her eyes, it was Calvin, the man who didn't live to see this moment, yet who, through his son, was finally freed from a silence he never deserved. Judge Naomi didn't leave her bench right away. She stayed seated, watching the boy walk away. And in that stillness, she thought to herself, justice doesn't always live in the hands of those who hold the gavel, but in the hearts of those who never stop believing in what's right. And then it was Levi, the boy once labeled a criminal, who left behind the final words in the court records. There are trials that don't end with a verdict, but begin the moment a boy dares to hold on to his father's memory and rise to reclaim the name of justice. Overwhelmed with emotion, Levi yanked the necklace from around his neck, stepping forward to confront Ezra, but 2 security guards quickly blocked his path, gripping his shoulders tightly. The entire courtroom fell into a dead silence, broken only by the sharp clink of the silver pendant hitting the cold tile floor. Celeste stood motionless, but her hand clutched a thin folder so tightly her fingernails nearly broke skin. It was the full internal report from the Durhagen Steelworks explosion, a copy she had hidden for nearly a decade, waiting for this exact moment. She rose and walked toward the witness stand, saying only one thing. "I have an audio recording. It's not just about my son, it's about how this system chose to blind itself to the truth." The courtroom lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life. Surveillance footage played. It showed Levi, still quiet, standing just outside the fence. He hadn't crossed it, hadn't caused a scene. He had simply stood there. Then came the voice, Ezra's voice, Don't let that kid get involved. But if he opens his mouth about his father, shut it down." The entire room froze. Levi lowered his head, not in weakness, but with the quiet strength of someone who finally understood. He didn't need to prove his innocence anymore. The truth had just spoken for itself. Security intervened just in time, holding Levi back before he could cross the line of his own fury. But his gaze still burned into Ezra like fire. For a split second, no one spoke. No one moved. The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. And Ezra, the man who moments ago looked untouchable, instinctively stepped half a pace back. Celeste walked to her son and gently guided him back to his seat. But instead of offering comfort, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn voice recorder, something she had carried with her for the past 8 years, as if it were proof of a dream no one believed in. What no one expected was that this recording, captured during a closed-door meeting at the Westfall Police Department, would become the key. The voice rang out, clear and undeniable. "If that explosion gets exposed, our people are done. Brooks was the pawn we sacrificed. Don't let the kid open his mouth." The courtroom swayed. A man stood, an unexpected witness, the former chief engineer of the plant, asking to confirm that the voice belonged to Ezra. Those who once dismissed Celeste now looked at her with a mix of shame and disbelief. Levi whispered, "You knew all this time?" Celeste didn't answer. She just took his hand, trembling but firm, because maybe only a mother could bear the weight of pain long enough, just so one day her son could stand in the light and finally call it by its name. Judge Naomi Prescott entered the courtroom, carrying with her not just authority, but a tension so sharp it settled over every breath in the room like a drawn wire. Her footsteps echoed, steady, deliberate, not fast, not slow, but enough to make everyone in that courtroom feel exposed. No one dared to speak, not even Ezra. But Levi, still clutching the silver necklace in his hand, was the one who met her gaze. Not with pleading, not with fear, but with a silent, unwavering whisper. "Please, don't look away." Naomi didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply opened her briefcase and pulled out a faded envelope, stamped, "Internal Archive, Millridge Blast Zone." Every eye in the room followed. Ezra, now slouching slightly, drew his arms in close, like a man trying to hide something only he could still feel. Naomi spoke. "This letter was written by Calvin Brooks 3 days before his death. It was never included in the official case files, but today it will be heard." The room held its breath. Levi froze, as if time itself had stopped. He had never heard his father speak of that final day. Celeste turned slightly away, her eyes quietly welling with tears that had waited years to fall. "If anything happens to me, know this: the one covering it all up is inside the department, and he won't stop, not until kids like mine are too afraid to speak the truth." No one breathed. The only sound was Levi's heartbeat thundering in his chest. For the first time in his life, he saw an adult stand for him, not with promises, but with the truth. The courtroom door opened. Celeste Warren, Levi's mother, stepped in. No one had been told she would appear, but the moment Ezra Calloway's eyes met hers, the entire room seemed to fall into a strange, heavy silence. His face turned pale. His hands began to tremble. And for the first time, Levi saw the man who had silenced his father. Suddenly rendered speechless, Naomi turned to her. "Do you have something to present?" Celeste didn't answer right away. She simply walked toward the witness stand, slowly pulling from her worn leather bag an old photograph. So faded the edges had yellowed with time. In the picture were 3 men in Durham Steelworks uniforms. One of them was Calvin Brooks. The other, standing beside him, was Ezra Calloway. "My husband, Calvin, didn't die in an accident. He knew he was being followed, and for 3 weeks before his death, he recorded every call. He stored all of it, just one copy on a hard drive. I kept it until today, because I was afraid. But my son, he cannot keep growing up in the same fear that raised me." Across the room, Ezra shot to his feet. "She's making this up. I never—" But Naomi raised her hand. "Sit down. Until the investigation is complete, you are hereby suspended from all legal duties." Levi turned to his mother. He didn't need to say a word. Her presence, at exactly the right moment, was all the proof he needed that he wasn't alone anymore. Levi turned to look at his mother, stunned. In all his life, he had never seen her speak up in front of a crowd, let alone in the choking tension of a courtroom like this. But Celeste didn't need words. She simply gripped her son's hand, slowly, firmly, as if she were passing him something he thought he had lost. Faith in the truth. Judge Naomi Prescott looked at the two of them, then turned her gaze toward Ezra. Lieutenant Calloway, based on the evidence just presented, and while we await authentication of the audio recording, I am issuing an immediate suspension of all your duties and authority over any legal proceedings from this moment forward. Ezra shot up from his chair, shouting, "You people have no idea what you're doing. This is slander. I've served justice for over 20 years. Naomi cut him off, her voice cold and clear. Then if you truly believe in justice, you should have no fear of being investigated. Silence blanketed the room. Only the sharp tap of a pen against the bench echoed through the air. Dry, final. Ezra was escorted out. The door closed softly behind him, but the sound landed like a gavel, sealing a verdict. Levi didn't move. There was no victory in his expression, no smile, no triumph. He simply bowed his head, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper, his father's handwritten letter, and handed it to Naomi. You should read this, not just to judge a man, but to understand why my father chose silence, and why today I couldn't. No one in that courtroom knew a truth buried for 8 years was finally being pulled into the light, not by power, but by the choice of a boy who had nothing left to lose. Levi gripped the necklace in his hand, then slowly stood. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I didn't come here to hide. I came to face this, not Ezra Calloway, my own fear. A pause. Then he walked slowly to the witness stand, opened a worn canvas bag, and pulled out a folded copy of his father's letter. A letter that didn't just recount the truth about the explosion, but held one final plea. If one day you have to choose, don't choose revenge. Choose justice, even if you have to stand alone. Naomi took the letter, her eyes beginning to shine. Celeste quietly returned to her seat, hand pressed against her chest, as if trying to hold something breaking open inside her. At the back of the courtroom, a group of students from Greystone High, Levi's classmates, suddenly rose to their feet. One spoke first. We believe him. Then the rest nodded, not because Levi was perfect, but because he had the courage to stand. He wasn't alone anymore, no longer drowning in silence. And in that moment, what Calvin Brooks had feared most no longer held true. The truth doesn't stay buried. Not when someone is brave enough to unearth it with love, not hatred. The trial resumed after a short recess. No one expected Celeste Warren, the mother who had remained silent through half the hearing, to suddenly rise and request to submit new evidence. From her worn leather bag, she pulled out a USB drive. On it was security footage taken from a hidden corner camera at the Millcroft building, the very place Levi was accused of trespassing. All eyes turned to the screen as the video played. There was Levi standing quietly, eyes fixed on the wall where a memorial plaque once hung, honoring victims of the Durham factory explosion, including his father, Calvin Brooks. He didn't step on the grass. He didn't cause a disturbance. He didn't do a single thing wrong. What shook the room even more was the image of Ezra Calloway, standing at a distance, holding a radio, watching Levi silently before calmly pressing the call for backup button. No words exchanged, no conflict, just a stare, one that said Levi had no right to exist there. Naomi kept her face composed, but her fingers tightened around her pen. You call that maintaining order, she said quietly, or reviving the distorted authority of a past we never dared to excavate? Celeste never shed a tear, but her voice broke slightly as she spoke. I didn't come here to protect my son out of motherly instinct. I came to restore a truth that should have been protected by this system 8 years ago. The courtroom was still. This was no longer about stepping on grass. This was about a wound, collective, deep, now laid bare by evidence, and by the heart of a mother unwilling to let the silence win. The video played again, this time in slow motion. Frame by frame, the truth unraveled. Levi stood there silent, just outside Lieutenant Ezra Calloway's lawn. Not even 30 seconds. He didn't step forward. He didn't touch a thing. Just a lone teenager in the fading light, as if searching for a piece of memory someone had stolen. A moment so still, and yet it had been twisted into a criminal charge. In the courtroom, eyes began to shift, not toward Levi, but toward Ezra. His face tightened. Sweat gathered at his temple, despite the room's cold air. Naomi tilted her head slightly, voice calm but cutting. And according to sworn testimony, this boy was considered a threat? No one answered. Celeste stood, her voice steady but sharp as a blade. They say my son damaged property, but the only thing destroyed here is the memory of the man who raised him. A quiet sigh escaped from the back of the courtroom, from a middle-aged man who once worked alongside Calvin Brooks. The silence of the community cracked. Slowly they were beginning to shift, not just as bystanders, but as people choosing a side. Naomi looked down at the file, then back at Levi. You're not the one on trial anymore, Levi. You're the reason justice is being retried. A stillness settled over the room, and in that silence, something began to change. The tension in the courtroom seemed to ease after the surveillance video, but Naomi Prescott wasn't finished. She placed the USB on the bench and spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the silence. This is an internal audio recording, captured at the Halloween Police Department on the night of April 17th that year. The speakers crackled to life. I've never believed people like Calvin Brooks could be innocent. His son's just a smaller piece of the same trash. The voice, raspy, unmistakable, was Ezra Calloway. The courtroom froze. These weren't words said in a moment of anger. They were habitual, deeply rooted in contempt, not just for Levi, but for the man who had once stood beside Ezra at Durham Steelworks and died because of it. Levi closed his eyes. His face twitched ever so slightly, but when he opened them again, the tremble was gone. Beside him, Celeste gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Her eyes no longer held pain, only the quiet, unstoppable strength of a mother who had waited too long to be heard. Then a man stood up, a former factory worker. His voice broke through the stillness. Calvin was the only one who stayed behind that night to shut off the power. If it wasn't for him, 10 of us wouldn't be alive right now. A wave of murmurs spread like a rising tide through the courtroom. Naomi nodded, her voice softer now, but thick with conviction. So, after 8 years, for the first time, justice has finally begun to listen. Celeste Warren stepped up to the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a crumpled letter, carefully preserved inside an envelope bearing the name Calvin Brooks, her husband, the factory worker who had lost his life in the Durham plant explosion. This letter was written just 3 days before he never came home. She handed it to Judge Naomi Prescott. The room held its breath. Naomi opened the letter and read the final lines aloud. If you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to speak the truth. But you need to know, the leak at Durham wasn't an accident. I saw Ezra Calloway take orders from inside. He delayed maintenance to the following week, even after I warned him. They needed a scapegoat to blame the tech crew, and I refused to stay silent. Ezra shot to his feet. Objection! That letter holds no legal weight. Naomi didn't flinch. She placed the letter gently on her bench, then spoke. Her voice, for the first time, no longer just that of a judge, but of a human being who understood the line between right and wrong. I once believed it was my job to uphold the law, but today I've learned something more. Law should never outrank the truth, and the truth has spoken loud and clear. Her eyes turned to Levi, not as a figure to be judged, but as someone whose pain had finally been seen. Your case is no longer an isolated hearing. It marks the beginning of a much larger investigation. I hereby order the immediate suspension of Lieutenant Ezra Calloway and submit all evidence to the State Investigative Committee. A quiet wave of applause rippled through the room, not for victory, but because at last, someone within the system had chosen to stand with the truth. In the heavy silence of the courtroom, Judge Naomi Prescott slowly raised the letter. Her voice rang out, each word slicing through the air like a blade. Calvin Brooks wrote, I confronted Ezra Calloway. He knew compressor line 3 needed to be replaced. I submitted that report 3 times. All of them were held back. I'm not afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid Levi will lose his father and never know why. The room fell utterly still. All eyes turned to Ezra, who stared down at the floor, fists clenched, jaw twitching. From the defendant's bench, Levi lifted his head. His eyes glistened, but no tears fell. He turned to his mother. Celeste said nothing. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder, passing to him, without words, the promise Calvin once made. The prosecutor rose, flustered, ready to object, but Naomi raised her hand and stopped him. This courtroom is not a place to erase responsibility. Today, we are not just trying a boy. We are facing the conscience of an entire system. She looked directly at Levi. You didn't step on the grass, Levi. You stepped onto the fear that's blanketed this place for the past 8 years. And then, from the back row, a man stood up, an older gentleman, the retired lead engineer of the Durham plant. I was the one who altered Calvin's report back then. I can't stay silent anymore. The courtroom didn't erupt in noise. It cracked, like a dam breaking. Not with shouting, but with the quiet collapse of a wall of lies that had finally come down. Ezra Calloway shot to his feet, his face flushed red. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom as he tried desperately to seize back control. "That letter means nothing legally. And the recording, it could have been edited." But no one responded. The room had already shifted. Every gaze was now on Levi, the 16-year-old boy who still stood tall, still clutching his father's old necklace. But this time, with strength. Ezra turned to Judge Naomi. "I've served this department for 24 years. You're going to believe some kid over me?" Naomi calmly set her pen down. "I believe in justice." Silence wrapped the courtroom like a curtain falling. Ezra pointed frantically at the retired engineer who had just spoken. "He was fired for negligence. He's doing this for revenge." But the engineer simply said, voice steady and low, "No, I'm doing this to apologize. Too late maybe, but not too quiet." Levi turned to look at the man, and for the first time his eyes didn't hold pain. They held understanding. He nodded. Ezra stumbled backward, bumping into the bench behind him. For the first time he looked small. Not because he was accused, but because there was no one left to defend him. Naomi's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "This court orders a full investigation into the Durham Steelworks explosion and the immediate suspension of Lieutenant Ezra Calloway." A quiet breath of relief passed through the room, like a draft of air through a long sealed chamber. But in Levi's eyes there was no triumph, only release. For himself, for his father, for them all. Naomi Prescott, who had remained motionless through most of the hearing, finally gave a subtle nod. "This court hereby orders an independent investigation into matters involving Mr. Ezra Calloway. During this time, you are suspended from all duties and stripped of any authority to enforce the law." The courtroom fell silent. A few glances were exchanged, half in disbelief, half as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. Ezra curled his lips into a strained smile, his voice sharp and bitter. "Suspended, based on some anonymous audio and a few faded words in an old letter? This court's being driven by sentiment, not law." Naomi didn't argue. She simply turned to the court clerk and signaled to enter it into the record. Then she spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Justice is not sentiment. It's the obligation to face the truth, even when that truth makes it hard to look at ourselves in the mirror." Levi looked down at his hands. The old necklace now rested gently in his open palm. It was no longer just a keepsake. It was a living testament to a father buried beneath years of silence, fear, and carefully orchestrated lies. Celeste stood behind him, silent, her hand clenched. Only she knew the cost of keeping that letter safe all these years. The threats, the job she lost, the quiet corners of life she gave up just to hold on to one piece of truth. A single tear dropped onto the cold wooden floor. Ezra stood there, uncuffed, but stripped of all power, and Levi was no longer the boy on trial. He was now the voice that forced an entire town to finally listen. At exactly 10 a.m., Judge Naomi Prescott delivered her verdict. This court finds the defendant, Levi Hartman, not guilty of trespassing or disorderly conduct as originally charged. The new evidence has established that fact beyond any reasonable doubt. The courtroom exhaled all at once. A quiet eruption. Levi lifted his head, eyes red, not from tears but from the weight of belief finally being returned. But Naomi didn't stop there. This court also orders an official investigation into the cause of the 2017 explosion at Grayson Millworks, under suspicion of internal negligence, as outlined in the letter written by the late worker, Calvin Brooks. From the audience, an elderly woman began to weep. She was the widow of another worker, once dismissed as a casualty of workplace accident. Now, through Calvin's letter, her husband's silenced voice was finally being heard. Ezra no longer lifted his head. He sat hunched, hands locked tightly beneath the table, as if trying to strangle the very name he had spent years hiding behind. Celeste reached for Levi's hand. No words, just her fingers, those same fingers that had guided him through sleepless nights, still as gentle, still as strong, as the first time she ever held the hand of a boy growing up without a father. Outside the courthouse, there were no cheers, no banners, but something had shifted, something unseen, like the dust of years being brushed from the surface of a truth that was never meant to stay buried. Levi held the silver necklace, his father's final gift, tight in his hand, like a silent vow. He wasn't trembling anymore. He didn't bow his head. He didn't look away. In his eyes now was something that had risen above pain, a kind of strength no one teaches, only life demands you learn. Celeste stood beside him, her hand still resting gently on his shoulder. She said nothing, just looked at him with the eyes of a mother who had lost too much, but somehow held everything together. Between them, no words were needed, because now both understood. The truth wasn't in the verdict. It was in the way they had stood up to protect what was right. At the back of the courtroom, people who once stayed silent began to rise. Not to applaud, but to remember that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It must be called out, faced, and protected by the courage of those the world often overlooks. Levi walked out of the courthouse, not like someone who had just been cleared of charges, but like someone stepping into a new chapter of life. He wasn't out for revenge. He didn't forget. He simply chose to carry the memory and rewrite a future no longer shaped by fear or prejudice. If you've ever stayed silent in the face of injustice, does this story make you think twice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in truth, in courage, and in the power of family, don't forget to subscribe and follow stories that truly touch the heart. Some trials don't just decide right from wrong. They make an entire community look inward. The story of Levi Hartman isn't just about a 16-year-old boy wrongfully accused for standing on the lawn of a white police officer. It's a mirror held up to show how prejudice, silence, and generational pain can tear a family apart, unless someone dares to say, enough. Levi isn't a hero. He's just a boy holding on to an old silver necklace, what some called worthless. And yet, through quiet defiance, unwavering eyes, and belief in the man who raised him, Levi shook justice awake from a long slumber. By choosing to stand against the wind, he reminded us, the truth can be hidden, but it can't be buried forever. And his mother, Celeste, didn't need to shout to defend her son. All it took was one letter, one piece of evidence, one perfectly timed moment, to make a system finally listen again. The real lesson here isn't in the final verdict. It's in whether we're willing to hold the line for what's right, even when no one's standing with us. Because sometimes a single child holding on to a father's memory is enough to change an entire generation.